The pounding on my front door sounded like it wanted to break the hinges off, each jang echoing through the hallway before the sun had fully risen. Blue and red patrol lights flashed across my living room walls, slicing through the pale morning like a warning I'd been expecting for months, but still wasn't ready to face. When I stepped onto the porch, the cold air bit into my lungs and the crunch beneath my shoes told the whole story without me looking down. Shattered ceramics scattered across the lawn like fallen teeth. In my hands, I was still holding the last intact garden gnome, the only survivor of a silent war that no one else had wanted to see. Across the street, neighbors stood frozen on their porches, whispering behind coffee mugs while she screamed my name like a verdict. The HOA president pointed at the broken pieces, accusing me of vandalism and community violations as an ambulance siren wailed somewhere behind her fury. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing this morning wasn't chaos. It was the consequence of months of destruction, and what happened next could never be undone. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? When I first turned into Maple Ridge Circle, it felt like I had driven into one of those picture-perfect brochures real estate agents love to hand out. The road curved gently around a small island of trimmed hedges and a maple tree that looked like it had been measured with a ruler. Lawns were cut in straight lines, mailboxes stood evenly spaced like soldiers at ease, and every porch carried the same quiet promise of normal life. It was the kind of neighborhood where evening light glowed warm against beige siding, and people waved without needing to know your name yet. The day I moved in, two neighbors walked over with bottled water and polite smiles, asking where I was coming from and whether I needed help lifting boxes. I remember feeling relief more than excitement. After years of cramped apartments and thin walls, this cul-de-sac felt like a fresh page, a place where mornings could start with coffee on the porch and end with the simple comfort of knowing your home was truly yours. The Homeowners Association introduced itself within the first week, not through a knock on the door, but through a glossy welcome packet tucked neatly into my mailbox. Inside were newsletters printed on thick paper, community guidelines highlighted in friendly blues and greens, and a calendar of neighborhood events that made the place seem organized rather than restrictive. There were rules about trash bin placement, acceptable exterior paint shades, and lawn maintenance schedules. At the time, none of it felt threatening. It read more like instructions for keeping harmony than commands meant to control. The board members' photos were printed on the last page, smiling headshots under short bios that spoke about community pride and shared responsibility. I met the president at the next monthly gathering by the mailbox cluster. She extended her hand with a practiced smile and a tone that hovered somewhere between welcoming and supervisory. Her words were polite, but there was a subtle emphasis on phrases like, "We like things a certain way here," and "consistency keeps property values strong." I brushed it off as enthusiasm, the kind of over-involvement you expect from people who volunteer their time. She complimented my porch and then casually mentioned that decorative items should blend with neighborhood aesthetics. At the time, it sounded like harmless advice, the sort of comment you forget by the next morning. For the first few weeks, life settled into a calm rhythm. I planted flowers along the walkway, trimmed the hedges on Saturday mornings, and placed a small row of garden gnomes near the front steps. Nothing flashy, just a touch of personality in a sea of identical lawns. They made me smile every time I unlocked the door, tiny painted faces guarding the entrance like cheerful sentries. Then one morning, I stepped outside and found the first one lying in pieces near the curb. The break was clean, too deliberate to be an accident, yet small enough to dismiss as careless mischief. I picked up the fragments and told myself it was nothing, maybe a delivery truck tire or a careless passerby. When I mentioned it in an email to the HOA, the reply came quickly but felt oddly hollow. They expressed sympathy in a single sentence, then pivoted to reminding me about maintaining uniform decorative standards. It was polite on the surface, but the timing left a thin line of discomfort I couldn't quite explain. A week later, a printed letter appeared in my mailbox noting that non-standard lawn ornaments could be subject to review. The language was formal, almost sterile, yet it lingered in my mind longer than it should have. I began noticing other small things. A second newsletter with a paragraph about visual cohesion, a neighbor who once waved now only nodding, the president's smile tightening whenever her gaze drifted toward my front steps. None of it was overt hostility, just tiny shifts that turned the air slightly heavier each day. I told myself I was overthinking, that every community had its quirks and paperwork. Still, when another envelope arrived, stamped with the HOA seal, thicker than the others and folded with precise edges, I felt a quiet chill before I even opened it. Inside was an official notice citing unsightly lawn statues and requesting immediate correction. The words were calm, almost clinical, but the message was unmistakable. The gnomes had been seen, and they were no longer welcome. The first real confrontation didn't come through a letter or an email. It came with heels clicking up my driveway on a quiet Saturday morning while I was watering the hedges. I turned and saw her walking straight toward me with a clipboard pressed against her chest like a badge of office. She didn't wave this time. She didn't smile either. She stopped at the edge of the walkway, looked down at the line of garden gnomes and exhaled as if I had personally offended her morning. Her voice was calm but carried the sharpness of a verdict already decided. She spoke about community standards and visual harmony, using phrases that sounded rehearsed, as if she had been waiting for the chance to deliver them out loud. I tried to explain that they were small decorations, harmless, personal, something that made the house feel like mine. She nodded without listening, then bent down, picked up the nearest gnome, and let it slip from her fingers onto the concrete. The ceramic cracked in two clean pieces. She didn't apologize. She simply wrote something on the clipboard and turned away while two neighbors watched from across the street in stunned silence. After that day, the letters multiplied. First came a warning notice taped to the mailbox, then an official fine folded inside an envelope with my address printed in bold black ink. Emails followed, their tone colder each time, filled with phrases like non-compliance and continued disregard. My inbox began to feel like a courtroom where every message carried a new accusation. My spouse tried to calm me, reminding me that rules existed everywhere and that maybe removing the decorations would end the tension. A neighbor named Daniel stopped by one evening and quietly admitted that he'd received similar notices over flower colors and mailbox height. Hearing that should have comforted me, but it only confirmed that this wasn't about decorations. It was about control. Her personality revealed itself more clearly with each interaction. She never raised her voice, never used obvious threats, yet every word was framed like an order disguised as advice. She attended every HOA gathering with the same rigid posture, the same measured smile, and an almost theatrical confidence when addressing the crowd. She spoke about property values as if they were sacred law, and about uniformity as if individuality were a violation. People listened, some out of agreement, most out of habit. I began to notice how conversations hushed when she approached, how neighbors straightened their shoulders as if being inspected. Authority followed her like a shadow she enjoyed casting. The fines grew larger, the emails more pointed. What had started as a small disagreement over lawn ornaments turned into a steady pressure that followed me into evenings and weekends. I found myself rereading notices late at night, feeling disbelief slowly harden into anger. It wasn't just about ceramic figures anymore. It was about the idea that something so trivial could be used to measure obedience. Each new letter felt less like communication and more like surveillance, a reminder that someone was watching, waiting for another excuse to write my name down again. Then one morning, I stepped outside and felt the familiar crunch beneath my shoes, only this time it was louder, wider, unavoidable. 3 more gnomes lay shattered across the grass, pieces scattered as if someone had taken deliberate time to make sure none could be repaired. My stomach tightened as I looked toward the small security camera mounted above the porch, the one I had installed weeks earlier for peace of mind. The tiny green indicator light was dark. The screen inside showed nothing but static. Whatever had happened overnight had not only destroyed the decorations, it had erased the only witness I had. After the camera went dark, the pressure stopped pretending to be polite. The next HOA meeting felt less like a gathering and more like a courtroom where the verdict had already been whispered before I walked in. Conversations hushed when I took a seat, then rose again in careful fragments, words like standards and violations, floating through the room like accusations without names attached. When I spoke, asking simple questions about vandalism and accountability, the tone shifted. Smiles tightened. Eyes rolled. The president responded with practiced calm, framing my concerns as exaggerations and reminding everyone that some residents struggle to follow guidelines. It was subtle, but the message was clear. I wasn't a victim. I was a problem. Soon, neighbors I had once waved began avoiding eye contact. A few still offered quiet sympathy, but most kept their distance as if my front lawn carried a contagious stain. Anonymous notes appeared in my mailbox, folded twice with no return address, warning me to respect community harmony or consider relocating. At first they sounded almost friendly, but the language hardened over time, turning into blunt suggestions that I was unwelcome. Inspections became more frequent, no longer scheduled but announced by sudden footsteps on the gravel and the sound of someone circling the house with a clipboard. I caught glimpses of shadows moving past the side fence, measuring, photographing, documenting details that had never mattered before. It felt less like living in a neighborhood and more like existing under observation. Sleep became shallow and unreliable. Every late-night car door or distant bark jolted me awake, heart pounding as if the sound were meant for my driveway. My family started locking doors earlier, closing blinds that used to stay open to let in evening light. Conversations shifted from weekend plans to contingency thoughts. What if the fines kept growing? What if the letters turned into lawsuits? What if the hostility crossed another line? The house that once felt like a milestone began to feel like territory that needed defending. The emotional weight didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated slowly, like dust settling, until the air itself felt heavy. I tried seeking help, hoping an outside voice would reset the balance. The local police listened, nodded, and labeled the incidents as minor disputes, suggesting mediation or formal complaints rather than intervention. Their tone was professional but distant, the kind that reduces personal turmoil to paperwork categories. When I mentioned the broken decorations and disabled camera, the response was sympathetic yet cautious, framed as civil matters unless direct evidence appeared. The HOA used that neutrality skillfully. Emails circulated among residents portraying me as confrontational, someone who refused cooperation and created unnecessary tension. The narrative shifted with quiet efficiency, and suddenly I was not the one being harassed. I was the one disturbing peace. The weeks blurred into a pattern of letters, meetings, and the constant awareness that any small detail could be turned into another citation. I began checking the lawn before unlocking the door each morning, bracing for damage the way one braces for bad weather. The 23rd gnome lay shattered near the walkway on a gray dawn that felt colder than the others. Its pieces were arranged too neatly to be accidental, almost ceremonial. Tucked beneath the fragments was a printed notice sealed in plastic, citing repeated non-compliance and outlining the first steps of eviction proceedings. I stood there holding the paper, the neighborhood silent around me, realizing that what started as decoration had become a campaign, and this was no longer about statues or standards. This was a warning that my place here was being erased one piece at a time. The eviction notice should have broken me. For a few minutes it almost did. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the words, listening to the refrigerator hum like distant static, feeling the weight of every letter that had piled up over the months. Then something shifted. The fear that had been living quietly in my chest gave way to a different feeling. Not anger this time, not panic, but clarity. Because the truth was, I had not been as passive as they believed. While they were sending warnings and staging inspections, I had been preparing in silence. Months earlier, after the second broken statue and the first dismissive response, I stopped assuming accidents. I installed cameras that didn't glow or beep, small lenses tucked beneath the porch light, inside the mailbox frame, and along the edge of the garage trim where no one ever looked. I learned angles, blind spots, timing. I kept logs, dates, times, screenshots, every email printed and filed in chronological order. I even spoke with a legal consultant under the guise of asking general questions about property rights, never once mentioning names. What began as simple caution turned into routine discipline. Every incident was documented. every interaction saved. While they saw scattered decorations, I was building a record. The change in mindset didn't arrive with fireworks or dramatic speeches. It arrived quietly, like a switch flipping from survival to intention. I stopped reacting to each letter as if it were a personal attack and began seeing them as entries in a pattern. Instead of losing sleep over the next inspection, I started anticipating it, positioning cameras to capture angles I had missed before. The narrative inside my head shifted from, "Why is this happening?" to, "How do I prove it?" That subtle difference made everything feel steadier. I wasn't just enduring anymore. I was observing, collecting, preparing. The most unexpected discovery came from something I almost overlooked: the HOA's own newsletters and meeting minutes posted online. Out of curiosity, I compared fine amounts, dates, and enforcement notes. The inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. Certain homes were cited repeatedly for trivial issues, while others, with obvious violations, were never mentioned. Names appeared and disappeared in records without explanation. Financial summaries listed maintenance expenses that didn't match visible work in the neighborhood. It wasn't a dramatic criminal conspiracy, at least not on the surface, but it was selective enforcement dressed up as fairness. Authority wasn't being applied evenly. It was being aimed. Once I saw that pattern, I realized I wasn't the first target, just the most recent one who refused to disappear quietly. That realization was strangely empowering. The fear that had made me flinch at every envelope turned into a sense of balance. They had power, yes, but power leaves footprints when it moves too often in the same direction. I no longer felt like someone trapped in a dispute over decorations. I felt like someone standing at the edge of a larger truth, one that only needed the right moment to surface. Every shattered piece on the lawn stopped looking like loss and started looking like evidence of intent. I placed the broken eviction notice into the same folder as the others, not as surrender, but as confirmation that the pressure had reached its peak. If they were willing to escalate to threats of removal, then they were confident no one was watching closely enough to challenge them. That confidence was their blind spot. I realized I didn't need to shout or argue at meetings anymore. I needed one clear moment that couldn't be twisted into opinion or dismissed as exaggeration. That was when the idea of the final gnome stopped being sentimental and became strategic. It would not be a decoration this time. It would be a marker, a visible line drawn in plain sight, positioned exactly where cameras overlapped and timestamps aligned. Not an act of defiance, but a controlled test. I wasn't placing it to provoke. I was placing it to reveal. Once the decision was made, everything became deliberate. I stopped moving through my days casually and started moving with intention, as if each step needed a reason behind it. The cameras that had once been scattered out of caution were repositioned with precision. I studied the angles of sunlight, the shadows cast by the porch railing, the reflection off the neighbor's parked car across the street. Every lens was adjusted so that no single blind spot remained untouched. I tested motion alerts at different hours, recorded timestamps, and labeled each file as if I were preparing evidence for a courtroom rather than a dispute over lawn ornaments. The routine was quiet, almost invisible from the outside, but inside the house it felt like assembling a puzzle where every piece mattered. Conversations with neighbors shifted from small talk to quiet acknowledgments. Daniel stopped by one evening under the excuse of borrowing a tool, but his tone carried a seriousness that hadn't been there before. He admitted he had seen late-night inspections that never appeared on official logs. Another neighbor mentioned receiving fines that mysteriously vanished after private conversations with the board. None of them wanted public confrontation, but several agreed to speak if things escalated. It wasn't a dramatic alliance, no raised fists or vows of rebellion, just subtle nods and shared understanding. Their willingness to testify, even quietly, felt like the first real confirmation that I wasn't imagining the imbalance. I began noting their observations with dates and times, turning whispered experiences into structured records. The first small victory arrived without fanfare. One evening, while reviewing footage, I noticed a figure stepping onto my driveway long after sunset. The angle caught only the side profile, but the posture and clipboard were unmistakable. The recording showed a brief inspection that had never been announced or documented, a silent confirmation of what I had suspected for weeks. Another clip revealed someone pausing near the mailbox, lifting the lid, and slipping something inside without knocking. These moments weren't explosive revelations, but they were undeniable. Each file added weight to the narrative that had been dismissed as exaggeration. At the same time, financial inconsistencies in public HOA summaries became clearer as I compared archived reports. Numbers shifted between months without explanation, maintenance costs appeared for projects that never materialized, and enforcement fees rose without corresponding approvals. Individually, they looked like clerical errors. Together, they formed a pattern too consistent to ignore. Then the parallel thread arrived, delivered with the same polished tone that had once felt welcoming. An email announced an emergency disciplinary meeting scheduled within days, citing ongoing non-compliance concerns and urging attendance from all residents. The language was formal, but the timing was unmistakable. Just as my documentation reached clarity, the board moved to accelerate pressure. It felt like a chess move made in confidence, an attempt to corner me publicly before I could present anything concrete. Instead of panic, I felt a sharpened focus. The cat-and-mouse rhythm had reached a stage where both sides sensed the other's preparation, even if neither could see it fully. I spent the next evenings double-checking everything. Camera batteries replaced, storage drives backed up, timestamps synchronized. The house grew quieter as the plan solidified, every click of a mouse and shuffle of paper carrying a sense of purpose. I no longer checked the lawn with dread each morning, I checked it with anticipation, knowing that clarity often arrives disguised as conflict. The fear that once followed every letter had transformed into patience, the kind that waits for a single undeniable moment instead of chasing dozens of small ones. When the time came, I stepped outside just before dusk and placed the 24th gnome at the center of the walkway where it could not be missed. Its bright pink contrasted against the trimmed grass, a deliberate point of visibility rather than decoration. I adjusted its position by a few inches, aligning it with the overlapping camera views I had mapped out days earlier. From the street it looked harmless, almost cheerful. From my monitors inside, it was a focal point where every lens converged. I returned indoors, activated full surveillance, and watched the screens settle into their steady glow, knowing that whatever happened next would no longer vanish into silence. The announcement of the emergency meeting traveled through the neighborhood faster than any newsletter ever had. By the afternoon, people were already talking in low voices at the mailbox cluster, glancing toward my house as if it had become a landmark instead of a home. Curtains shifted when I walked past. Conversations paused a second too long before resuming. It felt like the entire cul-de-sac had agreed, without saying it out loud, that something decisive was about to happen. The meeting room at the community center filled earlier than usual that evening, folding chairs arranged in neat rows that somehow looked more like an audience than a group of neighbors. She stood near the front with her clipboard, posture straight, smile polished, greeting people with the calm confidence of someone certain the outcome was already secured. Inside my pocket, my phone felt heavier than usual, not because of its weight, but because of what it held. I had reviewed the footage so many times that the timestamps were etched into memory, yet I checked them again while sitting in the back row. Every file opened smoothly, every angle aligned exactly as planned. Daniel caught my eye from across the room and gave a subtle nod, the kind that meant he was ready if his name was called. Another neighbor sat 2 chairs away pretending to scroll through messages, but I recognized the same nervous rhythm in her fingers that mirrored my own heartbeat. We weren't a visible alliance, just scattered individuals connected by shared experience, each pretending this was a routine gathering instead of a turning point. When the meeting began, her voice carried easily across the room, measured and rehearsed. She spoke about community integrity and ongoing disturbances, her gaze drifting toward me with deliberate pauses. The language was polished, but the intent was sharp. She framed the situation as a pattern of disregard rather than a series of incidents, turning broken decorations into symbols of defiance. I felt the familiar rise of disbelief, the urge to interrupt, but I let it pass. Every second she spoke without challenge tightened the tension, stretching it thin enough to hum in the silence between sentences. Then the accusations became direct. She described acts of vandalism without naming them as such, implying negligence and disruption while the room shifted uncomfortably. Heads turned, some sympathetic, others wary of being seen choosing a side. My pulse slowed instead of racing. an unexpected calm settling in as I realized how predictable the performance had become. This was not confrontation yet, this was positioning, an attempt to shape the narrative before evidence ever touched the table. I watched the expressions around the room, curiosity, doubt, fatigue, and understood that perception here was a current, always moving toward the strongest voice unless something anchored it. I checked my phone once more beneath the table, confirming that every recording remained intact. The glow of the screen reflected faintly against my palm, a quiet reassurance that preparation had not been wasted. Across the aisle, Daniel shifted in his seat as if ready to stand at a moment's notice. The air in the room thickened with anticipation, every cough or chair scrape echoing louder than it should have. Time stretched, turning minutes into something longer, heavier, like the pause before a storm breaks but refuses to show its first drop. Her confidence grew with each statement, the smile sharpening into something closer to triumph. She concluded her remarks by suggesting immediate corrective action, emphasizing urgency as though delay itself were a violation. The room murmured, uncertainty rippling through the rows. I felt the weight of dozens of eyes without looking up, the sensation both isolating and strangely clarifying. This was the edge of the moment, the line where preparation either proves itself or dissolves into silence. Without waiting for a response, she snapped her clipboard shut and stepped away from the podium, heels striking the floor with finality. Her voice rose just enough to carry across the room as she declared an immediate inspection of my property, tonight, without delay. Conversations froze mid-sentence, the air tightening around the announcement like a held breath. She moved toward the exit with unwavering certainty, and as the door swung open behind her, I realized the confrontation everyone had been circling was no longer theoretical. It was already walking toward my front lawn. By the time I reached my driveway, headlights were already cutting across the lawn in sharp white beams. A small crowd had followed from the meeting, drawn by curiosity more than loyalty, their shadows stretching long across the pavement. She stepped out of her car with the same rigid confidence, clipboard still tucked under her arm, as if it granted authority even outside the meeting room. Without greeting anyone, she walked straight toward the walkway where the final gnome stood under the porch light, its painted smile almost defiant against the dark. Conversations hushed. The night air felt tight, charged, like the moment before thunder cracks. She began speaking about violations again, words flowing quickly, louder than necessary, as if volume could replace certainty. Then, with a sharp motion, she reached down and grabbed the gnome. For a split second, everything slowed. The scrape of ceramic against stone, the collective inhale from the neighbors, the faint red blink of the porch camera catching the angle perfectly. She lifted it higher, intent clear in the arc of her arm, but her heel slipped on the edge of the walkway. The motion that was meant to be decisive became clumsy. The gnome fell from her grip, shattered at her feet, and she stumbled forward, catching herself awkwardly against the railing. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The sound of breaking ceramic echoed louder than any accusation she had spoken. Inside the house, screens lit up in perfect synchronization. I stepped back just enough to let the monitors glow through the front window, angles displayed like undeniable witnesses. Every movement replayed in real time. The approach, the raised hand, the deliberate intent, the fall. Murmurs turned into clear whispers as neighbors realized the moment wasn't a matter of opinion anymore. It was recorded, time-stamped, impossible to reinterpret. I opened the door and projected the footage onto the living room wall, the images spilling out into the doorway where everyone could see. The narrative that had once been controlled by confident speeches now fractured under the weight of clarity. Authorities arrived within minutes, their lights painting the street in alternating blue and red. The footage rolled again, this time accompanied by printed records, emails, financial summaries laid out like pieces of a puzzle finally assembled. Questions shifted direction. Instead of asking why decorations had been placed, they asked why enforcement had been selective, why notices differed from reports, why numbers didn't align with visible work. The tone changed from suspicion to scrutiny. Neighbors who had stood silently weeks earlier now spoke, adding their own experiences in hesitant but growing voices. The balance that had once leaned entirely in her favor tipped, not violently, but undeniably. Her confidence faded not with shouting but with silence. The clipboard that had once been held like a symbol of order now hung loosely at her side. Each replay of the footage stripped away another layer of certainty until what remained was simply a person standing under porch light with no narrative left to control. The crowd that had gathered out of curiosity shifted position, their posture no longer defensive or cautious but openly questioning. Support moved not as a wave but as a series of small steps, each neighbor choosing clarity over habit. When the officers escorted her toward the patrol car, the street fell into a stunned quiet broken only by the low murmur of conversations restarting with new understanding. The shattered ceramic still lay on the walkway, no longer evidence of loss but of exposure. I felt the adrenaline drain slowly, replaced by a steadiness I hadn't known in months. The lawn looked the same as it had the night before, the houses unchanged, yet something fundamental had shifted. It wasn't victory in the loud sense. It was the relief of weightlifting, of knowing that what had been whispered and denied now stood plainly in the open. The neighborhood watched as the patrol lights faded down the road, and in that fading glow, it became clear that the silence which once protected intimidation had finally been replaced by something stronger, shared awareness that would not easily disappear. Instead of warnings and violations, they carried formal statements about leadership suspension, pending investigations, and interim board appointments. The name that once dominated every newsletter disappeared almost overnight, replaced by neutral language and temporary committees. Audits were announced, meetings rescheduled, policies rewritten in careful wording that emphasized transparency and equal enforcement. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was procedural, steady, and unmistakable. Authority that once felt immovable had shifted into accountability, and the difference showed in every document pinned to the community board. What surprised me more than the paperwork was the change in people. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact began stopping by again, some with hesitant smiles, others with quiet apologies that didn't need many words. One brought over a plate of cookies. Another offered to help replant the flowers along the walkway. Lawns that had felt like separate territories slowly opened back into shared space. Conversations returned to sidewalks and driveways, casual and unguarded, the way they had been when I first moved in. Weekend gatherings resumed near the cul-de-sac island, children riding bicycles in wide circles while adults exchanged stories about ordinary things again. The tension that once hovered over every interaction faded, replaced by a collective relief that no single person had to carry the weight anymore. Inside the house, the change was even more personal. I stopped checking cameras first thing in the morning. The porch light no longer felt like a spotlight, and the sound of a car door closing at night didn't send a rush of worry through my chest. The folders of documentation remained in a drawer, not as weapons, but as reminders of what patience and persistence could accomplish when fear refused to dictate the outcome. I found myself sitting on the steps some evenings, watching the sun settle behind identical rooftops, realizing that peace isn't just the absence of conflict, it's the presence of trust restored piece by piece. Looking back, the months of tension felt longer than they were, stretched by uncertainty and the feeling of standing alone. Yet the resolution showed me something I hadn't fully understood at the start. Silence protects imbalance, but shared truth dismantles it. The decorations that once caused division became symbols of something larger, not rebellion, not defiance, but the simple insistence that fairness should apply evenly to everyone. Patience wasn't weakness, and documentation wasn't paranoia. Together they formed a quiet strength that didn't need raised voices to be effective. Unity didn't arrive as a grand movement. It arrived in small decisions made by ordinary people choosing clarity over convenience. The house feels different now, not because anything structural changed, but because the space around it feels honest again. The lawn is just grass, the walkway just stone, yet they no longer carry the weight of scrutiny. Home has returned to being what it was meant to be, a place where mornings begin without hesitation and evenings end without anticipation of conflict. The greatest change isn't visible from the street. It's the knowledge that truth, when shared, has a way of outlasting intimidation. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline File Stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?